So please do bear with us. The morning session by my colleague Adam Jackson just set out what Grant Thornton the firm is doing as an employer in terms of delivering social value. What Adam thought would be helpful is just to share some of our insights, particularly our work with local government and what we think is going on. So really just to add a pulse check to the excellent case studies we've already heard. Part of my specific brief, though, was to talk about rules. Now, obviously, that's a much drier topic after them two fantastic case studies. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to partly stick to the brief, and I'm partly going to game that brief, if you will, and talk about, bring together some of the threads of the conversation from earlier today, if that's okay. So the title of the presentation is actually Investing to Win with a Financial and Social Return. Ultimately, to frame that as a question is, what problem is local government trying to solve by doing things differently, whether that's through procuring services, commissioning services, investing pension funds, mobilising, employing in a certain way, and how is that linked to the public service ethos? And what we're actually seeing in the marketplace, due to a number of reasons, authorities rethinking essentially how they do more with less. And procurement and social value is part of that. So some of the insights we wanted to share is based on public research that Grant Thornton has been undertaken over the last 18 months under the banner of the income spectrum, which is looking at how authorities are looking to essentially balance budget by 2020 beyond, because it's that point where central government grant ends. And so they have an issue. The issue is, do they stop or reduce public services, or do they look at other opportunities to work with partners to deliver those services on their behalf or with them, or do they look to commercialise some of their assets to help infill budget shortfalls? So the income spectrum is posing a challenge, and the question is, are they in it for profit, or are they in it for other reasons too? Now, what we're actually seeing in the marketplace, and I apologise, some of this is a microdot, the report is freely available on our website. What you see in the marketplace, given what people are telling us, through different ways they trade, and legally allowed to trade, and I'll come back to the rules and stick to part of the brief in a moment, is through charging, making fees and charges. So that might be through car parking, that might be through some authorities, garden waste, it might be through asset management, whether that's buildings that they own in terms of the town hall, libraries. It might be through small spun-off companies, and I'll come back to that, about public trading companies and social value. But also through treasury investments. So we see a number either through the direct balance sheet or in partnership with municipal pension funds looking to invest in new commercial activities. And part of that is driven by a need to balance budget, genuine concerns about withdrawing public services as demand is going up. People are struggling, families are struggling, and demands are going up at a moment in time when resources are going down. But also thinking about, how do we achieve multiple outcomes with the same spend? How can we be commercial and trade in a way that actually that helps us balance budget, brings in income, but also deals with some of these important close to home issues, affordable housing, protecting vulnerable children, all these things that cost money. So part of that is we see a number of authorities thinking about in terms of scanning the opportunities out there, given the mandate, the confidence, the assets, local and institutions, thinking about, in terms of that, what's the strategic fit between the key outcomes that we want to talk to, and Greater Manchester talked about that, in terms of whether that's about a great place to work, live and play, through to what's the ease of implementation. Do we have the skill sets to deliver this? Do we have the credibility? So what's our risk appetite to try something new? I wanted to take a step back though, and so particularly if people who work in local government or work with local government will have seen over particularly the last 12 months, whilst there's a pressure on budgets downward, and we'll come to a complete central government grant end in 2020, which is just around the corner, on one hand, local authorities are being challenged to be more commercial. And on the other hand, saying, you're being too commercial. Why are you competing with the private sector? And so part of that delicate balance is getting the right and justifying what they're doing and why. And I'll come back to some of the real changes around that on why it's important to social value per se. But for get to that, it's important to take a step back and recognise over more than 150 years, local authorities have been trading commercially with a social purpose. It's great we've got new acts in different parts of the country and around the world, and I'll talk to that in a moment too. But actually, it's coming back to what problem they're trying to solve. So going back to one of the very early forms of commercial trading was the City of Edinburgh, more than 150 years ago. And they set up an energy company, which is now back in fashion over the last half decade. But why did they do that? Some of it was about income, but it was about safe streets for women to walk down. In terms of that gas light company, it was about warm homes. So there's a proud heritage of local government in terms of social value and commissioning and procuring services. And we see that change over the years as some powers, their ability to do that have been withdrawn and then reintroduced. And in terms of how the world's moved on in terms of technologies and social needs too. So you may not know this, but not too long ago there was a number of local social stock exchanges in the different regions. They've come back involved now, haven't they? In Liverpool, Reading and elsewhere. Good ideas last. Sticking to part of the brief that have been set, or sticking partly to the brief that have been set, is actually correct grammar, isn't it? Is really just wanted to unpack a bit more, not restate what's been said already, but just in terms of social value, there's a number of powers, obligations, moral, financial, but in the different parts of the islands. And I think sometimes I've heard in some quarters that based on social value and the Localism Act, that actually England is one that is leading the world. There's a question mark in our minds about, is it leading in the islands? So if you look at things that Wales are doing about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, in many ways that can be described as social value on Red Bull. Okay? They're actually saying, think about not just this generation in terms of social value, but generations ahead. You could challenge whether they have the capacity and some of the social infrastructure to then deliver on that. Now, when you compare that to some other parts of the world, Black Economic Empowerment in South Africa, US Community Reinvestment Act, some of which we're seeing more policy and mobility in parts of Scotland, there's question marks again. The point being is there's lots of great learning outside of these shores too. I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'll come back to more rules, but one of this is understanding existing powers. So one of the things that came up this morning about, and I heard it in some of the breaks around, and it's mentioned in the conversations already, that actually in many ways local authorities already had existing powers, and maybe the great value of the Social Value Act is to provide further impetus for something to people to gather around and to mobilise. So if you look at other ways people can intervene as a local authority, yes, procurement is a huge one, but there's other things in terms of local planning frameworks, in terms of municipal pension funds, or actually their ability to convene. Now, just to give it, I'll give an example of this, coming back to Manchester, and we discussed this before the break, Pete, just around modern slavery, about what's a legal obligation, actually going beyond that. But so I think part of that is understanding, with the shrinking budget envelope, at the same time increasing public service demands, what's the best you can do by thinking about the host of possible interventions and bringing those together in terms of procurement and other types of intervention. In many ways, it's what the local facilitation ability can be just as strong as regulation. Again, partly responding to the brief around some of the real changes, it's important to recognise that perhaps if people are not familiar with some of the financial rules around local government, is those rules changed in February. And whilst, essentially it's in two parts. One is that through central government guidelines around local authorities' investment code and through local government treasurer guidelines, what they call the Sit for Potential Code for Capital Finance, is basically the rule book for how they can trade. Now, part of that is to do with, in part to do with procurement, but more broadly around broader commissioning. So particularly through investing in new physical and social infrastructure. It's a tightening up of what local authorities can do. So as well as them producing, which they're legally required to do, annual statements about what they're investing in, they have to say why. And so there's more robustness around options at present. Why is that relevant to here? Is because social value can be driven through a number of different types of interventions. And that's really important when you're thinking about what's the best you can do given your local area. In some areas, we had particularly through development from Croydon and Section 106 agreements, if people aren't familiar with that terminology, that's basically a developer contribution. There's a negotiation as part of that to get planning approval. And there might be some form of social return attached to that. In some areas, the offer for inward investment is so weak, they have to subsidise an investor coming in. They're paying them to come in rather than investing paying to play. So part of that again is thinking these new rules will impact on some of those social value considerations and the ability to negotiate. That's the easy bit. And what we're seeing more broadly in the public sector is a refresh, a good word, a refresh of a plethora of other non-financial and financial standards which shape the way that they're able to trade and operate. And it's quite interesting one compares these in terms of what are voluntary and what's mandated, in terms of which ones have rapidly emerged and which are already normalised. So I think an example of that might be around environmental management systems, tend to be in lots of local government procurement standards. People kind of get it, the market can respond to that, but by and large, voluntary in that respect. Whereas we look at some others, particularly more emergent ones, particularly around Modern Slavery Act, clearly a very important issue around trafficking, women's rights, freedom of labour and human rights obligations. That places an onus not just on companies to report above a certain turnover, but there's a whistleblowing obligation for public bodies too. What's interesting, particularly Grant Thornton as accountants, we audit, as well as Croydon, we audit Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and part of that, speaking to the police commissioners, there's an obligation, but people kind of don't know how to implement it because it's such rapidly emerged. There's a standard to do something, so part of this came together to say, actually, how do we problem solve this? And there's precedent for that. If you wind back 10 years around climate change and reporting, before that 20 years around child labour in the supply chain, and even further back, just basic issues such as seat belts and things like that. Sometimes things can emerge so quickly, people grapple with how to actually implement it. Why is that important to social value considerations? Again, is also because we see authorities are being asked to respond to a number of previously voluntary codes, which are becoming essentially backdoor mandated through procurement or investment decisions. So, as well as living wage, you also see in terms of carbon disclosures, so cities of, I think, Manchester too, Glasgow, voluntary report against carbon emissions, because it's about institutional investment. So part of that is thinking then, if you're local government, how do you respond to these different codes and standards? So in summary then, wanted to suggest that one way of thinking about is about balance, particularly one's thinking about how local government organises itself in terms of governance. So first of all, rightly, the point of departure is what problem you're trying to solve through making use of the Social Value Act and procurement, and understanding that's part of other ways you intervene in terms of local planning frameworks, in terms of employment standards and so forth. And that needs to be hardwired in terms of, apologies for the acronym, this is local government speak, the medium-term financial plan, or just a financial plan in other people's language. Because if it's not in there, it doesn't matter. If it's not in there, it does not matter. Secondly, thinking about how does that hardwire into your way, you're offering checks and balances about if something's in there related to that, what's the monitoring and management and challenging around some of that. And we see that sometimes where a contract's awarded on financial and social value criteria, but they're only measured on financial criteria. Really important points. And then secondly, understanding sometimes local authorities are not best placed both to commission but actually deliver a number of these services, and how they have capacity to work with others to do that. And there's some issues around that, particularly we talked about health, because actually the powers to trade between local government and the NHS are completely different. For instance, VAT treatment, exemption, and abilities to own and trade shares. Now that's really important if for social value reasons you decided to set up a community interest company, because some of those partners can't legally do it. And you create a VAT liability. And then lastly, of course, it's about how you're feeding back and justifying this to lead to further growth and investment. It's quite interesting, the anecdotes about who asks for the information and who you're reporting back to. Some of those are members, but what we see in some other authorities, an example being Sheffield, is because they're attracting social impact investors, that's ditto Luton is, they have to report back to different partners around social value, and their reporting needs might be different. So again, balanced approach to thinking about going beyond the mandatory minimum and certain checks and balances in place. I'll stop there. Happy to take questions, and hopefully I've partly met the brief I was set around codes and rules. Thank you.
Thank you.